two nations, no shared borders, no direct colonial history with one another. Yet they've been at each other's throats for nearly 100 years. Today, join me as we explore the story behind history's hottest conflict and the headlines of recent articles. The full story of Iran and Israel. Welcome to the Capital Anatomy. Let's dive in. 1. Scrapped maps and conflicting promises. Let's turn back the clock to the moment the modern Middle East was built from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. The Ottomans had ruled this region for over 600 years. When the empire collapsed after World War I, Britain and France pulled out a ruler and started redrawing the map. They acted exactly like two real estate agents subdividing a foreclosed property. They completely ignored who was living on that property, what their ethnicity was, or what god they worshipped. Palestine then fell under British control. In 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to create a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But make no mistake, this wasn't exactly a purely moral act. It was more like a shrewd business move. Just imagine you're running a big store that's being threatened by robbers. What do? You hire a security guard. The British elite at the time believed that backing Zionism would help them pull in support from the Jewish communities in the US and Russia for the Allied powers. At the same time, it would create a friendly buffer zone to protect the Suez Canal, which was essentially their umbilical cord for trade with India. This was geopolitical strategy disguised as humanitarianism. Morality was just a supporting actor, but the fatal flaw was the contradiction. That same British government, not long before, had secretly promised the Arabs that if they rose up and stabbed the Ottomans in the back, they would be granted independence. London had sold the exact same piece of land to two different buyers and handed the keys to both of them. And when each side realized they'd been played, this land was locked into a mechanism of perpetual conflict under the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Everything blew up between 1947 and 1948. After the tragedy of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were slaughtered, the United Nations decided to split Palestine in half to create a lifeline for survival. But right at that moment, Iran stepped up and voted against it. Why? Because Tehran looked at the map and made a prophecy that this partition would spark a bloody cycle of violence for generations to come. Iran didn't hate Jewish people back then. They were just afraid of an endless war. And that prophecy came true almost immediately. On May 14th, 1948, Israel declared its statehood, and the very next day, 5 Arab nations sent their armies to attack. Not only did Israel not collapse, but it survived and expanded its territory. But for the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe, when 700,000 people lost their homeland completely. Two massive blocks of collective memory, one side traumatized by genocide, the other by the loss of their homes slammed into each other, creating an unbridgeable divide. But here's the plot twist of history. Right after opposing the partition, Iran actually became the second Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel. For decades after that, they were undercover allies, teaming up to deal with the Arab bloc. So, from being a clear-eyed prophet and a strategic partner, how did Iran turn into a mortal enemy, the sharpest thorn in Israel's side like they are today? 2. From a secret marriage to ideological enemies. The answer will surprise you. For decades after 1948, under the reign of the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was actually a silent strategic partner to Israel. Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, came up with a brilliant defense mechanism called the periphery doctrine. Picture this. If every next-door neighbor wants to throw bricks at your house, your best bet is to buddy up with the people living in the houses right behind those neighbors. Turkey and Iran were exactly those houses in the back. It was a secret marriage full of perks. Iran supplied the bulk of the oil for Israel's economic engine. The two countries even joined hands to build the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, a massive project that pumped oil from Iran straight to the Mediterranean Sea. It was like $1 billion secret tunnel that helped both of them dodge the embargo pressure from the Arab bloc. There were times when Iran didn't just shake hands with Israel, they were literally the gas tank fueling Israel's economy. Everything started to change from a wound in 1953. In 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh decided to nationalize the oil industry. He wanted to keep the profits from their natural resources for his own people. Do you think Western powers would just sit back and watch their gas station get snatched away? In August 1953, the US intelligence, CIA, and British MI6 directed a coup to overthrow Mossadegh, spending about $5.3 million in cash just to pass around as bribes. Right after that, American energy corporations comfortably grabbed a 40% stake in Iran's oil. For the Iranian people, that wasn't just a political event. It was undeniable proof that the West was perfectly willing to choke out democracy just to fill up their gas tanks for cheap. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. After being restored to power by the US, the Shah started ruling with an iron fist. He set up the notorious secret police agency called SAVAK, with direct professional training from the CIA and Israeli intelligence. SAVAK became a dark symbol of arrests, surveillance, and brutal torture. At this point, try putting yourself in the shoes of an average Iranian. Israel was no longer just some distant country beefing with the Arabs. Israel got lumped in with the US machine, becoming the muscle backing the dictator who was trampling on them every single day. And then 1979 hit like a tsunami. The Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah, bringing Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to power. He immediately turned the nation into an Islamic Republic. The new regime did a total reboot of their ideological operating system. The US was labeled the Great Satan, and Israel was seen as the octopus tentacle of the US in the Middle East. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was instantly seized and handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. The boiling point came in November of that year, when Iranian students stormed the US embassy, holding 52 American hostages for a grueling 444 days. Diplomatic relations crumbled to dust. So the reality is, Israel didn't move a single centimeter on the world map, but Iran had just gone through a brain transplant, shifting its ideology. And along with the new regime, the map of their most hated enemies was completely redrawn. Up to here, do you think the CIA's intervention in Iran in 1953 was a smart intelligence play during the Cold War to protect their interests? Or was it the absolute worst geopolitical blunder of the 20th century, handcrafting a dangerous enemy? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I really want to know what you think, because the story doesn't end here. Even after publicly declaring each other mortal enemies post-1979, these two countries were about to enter a spine-chillingly paradoxical phase, secretly shaking hands once again because they started getting terrified of a third, far more brutal power. 3. The Iran-Iraq War and the invention known as proxy warfare. The forge that shaped modern Iran's strategic mindset wasn't a mosque, but a brutal meat grinder that dragged on for 8 years. In 1980, Saddam Hussein unleashed his army to invade Iran. The grueling war claimed the lives of roughly 1 to 2 million people, with Iran suffering the most horrific casualties. In the eyes of Iranians, that war revealed a cold, hard truth. The world wanted them dead. Iraq at the time was getting pumped full of cash by both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and got the quiet nod of backing from both poles of the Cold War, the US, and the Soviet Union. Imagine getting jumped in an alleyway, and everybody on the street, including the cops and the gang members, happily hands the guy beating you up a baseball bat. That was exactly Iran's situation. But right in the middle of that hellfire, a massive historical paradox popped up. Israel became an arms supplier for Iran. That's right. While Supreme Leader Khomeini was out there chanting and calling Israel the Little Satan, Tel Aviv was secretly shipping tons of weapons over to Tehran. Why? Because the Israeli elite looked over at their neighbor Saddam Hussein and decided that the aggressive dictator in Baghdad was the much more immediate threat. The operating rule in the Middle East is pretty simple. The enemy of my enemy is my temporary arms dealer. Through Operation Seashell in 1981 and subsequent deals, Israel sold at least $500 million worth of weapons to the evil Iranian side. At the government level, geopolitics is always a bloody business contract, not a moral sermon. However, the true legacy of this war was a generational trauma. Being completely isolated, getting attacked with chemical weapons, and having to throw tens of thousands of young men into the meat grinder on the front lines taught Tehran an absolute rule for survival. And that is, never let a war happen on your own soil again. You have to play away games to protect your home turf. Out of this mindset, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, molded the Quds Force, a special ops branch dedicated purely to exporting military power beyond their borders. And then, in 1982, when Israel sent troops into Lebanon, Iran saw a golden opportunity. They poured in money, experts, and weapons to organize and train a local Shia militia group. They called it Hezbollah. This was a strategic invention that totally changed the game in the region. You can think of Hezbollah as a life insurance policy for the Tehran regime. Every single rocket fired from Lebanon, every single clash on Israel's northern border, is the premium Tehran pays to keep the flames of war thousands of miles away from their own capital. The embryo of the Ring of Fire strategy had taken shape. By the late 90s, Iran realized that to survive, they needed 2 layers of shields. The first shield, is the militia network to tie down their enemies from afar. But the second shield had to be something that would make any superpower think twice. And just like that, the Israel-Iran war officially stepped out of the dusty borders and walked straight into the atomic lab. 4. The nuclear era and the rules of the shadow war. As we rolled into the 21st century, this showdown was no longer about tossing ideological curses at each other in the headlines. It morphed into a survival equation based on the number of centrifuges and the range of missiles. The difference in perspective is absolute. For Tehran, having nuclear tech is the ultimate deterrent to guarantee the regime doesn't get toppled. But for Israel, a tiny country with zero strategic depth, a nuclear bomb in Iran's hands is an existential death sentence. Two logical arguments crashed into each other, creating a bloody dead end. To back up their proxy shield, Iran's ambitions didn't stop at nuclear reactors. They set to work building a massive land bridge, a direct corridor connecting Tehran through Baghdad, across Damascus in Syria, and pushing straight out to the Mediterranean Sea. It operates like a super-fast Amazon Prime delivery network, but instead of dropping off toilet paper or electronics, this system is busy shuttling ballistic missile parts and guidance tech over to Hezbollah. That's why you constantly see on the news that a ruined country like Syria is a matter of life and death for Iran's vision. If that main artery gets cut, Tehran's network will bleed dry. Once they realized this, Israel couldn't just sit around and wait, but kicking off an all-out war was way too risky. So the two countries stepped into what the intel community calls the shadow war. Iran's elite nuclear scientists started dying mysteriously on their way to work. In 2010, a hyper-sophisticated computer malware called Stuxnet, which the whole world quietly understood was the work of the US and Israel, hacked in and blew up a bunch of centrifuges at the Natanz nuclear facility. Meanwhile, over in Syrian airspace, Israel quietly carried out hundreds of airstrikes over the years to crush Iran's weapons convoys. They were waging a brutal war. It's just that both sides agreed to fight in the dark, and nobody officially took the credit. That veil of secrecy was ripped wide open by a media bombshell in 2018. Israel's Mossad intelligence agency pulled off an impossible heist. They broke into a rundown warehouse smack in the middle of Tehran and walked away with 55,000 pages of documents and tens of thousands of data files containing Iran's entire nuclear archive. Israel used this heist as the ultimate political trump card to knock on the White House's door, claiming that Tehran had been lying to the whole world about the scope of their nuclear weapons program. Of course, plenty of independent arms control experts pointed out that those documents mostly proved what Iran had done in the past, and didn't automatically prove they were breaking the deal in the present. But the political damage was already done perfectly. The JCPOA nuclear deal signed in 2015, which was a diplomatic triumph that let Iran get sanctions lifted in exchange for freezing their nuclear program, started falling apart. Even though international IAEA inspectors confirmed Iran was still playing by the rules at the time, US President Donald Trump decided to tear up the deal. The argument from the hawks in Washington and Tel Aviv was crystal clear. The deal was too loose. It had sunset clauses that would just expire on their own, and it completely turned a blind eye to Iran constantly test-firing ballistic missiles. And here's the physical mechanism you need to understand. After the US pulled out of the deal, Iran didn't just instantly enrich uranium to 60% overnight. They took small, steady steps, ticking the clock closer and closer to the red line. But what does enriching uranium to 60% actually mean? Think of making nuclear material like moving the ball down a football field. Pushing the ball from your own end zone to the 50-yard line takes the most time and effort. But going from 20% to 60%, you've basically covered 90% of the necessary physical distance. Once you hit 60%, you're standing right on the 1-yard line before the end zone. With just a tiny technical push over a few weeks, they can cross the 90% mark, hitting weapons-grade status. By 2025 to 2026, the IAEA calculated that Iran had stockpiled around 440 kilograms of this near-weapons-grade uranium. A massive question comes up here. Do you think tearing up the nuclear deal in 2018 was a tough, necessary move to choke out Iran's terror network? Or was it a catastrophic geopolitical blunder that accidentally pushed them closer to the doorstep of a nuclear bomb than ever before? Share your thoughts down in the comments. This is an issue that even Washington is still arguing fiercely over. At this point, the regional booby trap was fully set. Iran had wrapped a ring of fire around Israel's neck, while Israel believed its enemy was just weeks away from perfecting the doomsday button. Both nations had pushed each other to the absolute edge of the shadow war, and the only thing missing was a spark. That spark dropped on October 7th, 2023. 5. Boiling point and the collapse of plausible deniability. On October 7th, 2023, an earthquake struck, but it didn't just conjure up the Israel-Iran war out of thin air. Instead, it did something way more dangerous. It grabbed the entire underground network that Iran had painstakingly built over decades and dragged it right out into the sunlight. When Hamas swarmed across Israel's southern border, killing roughly 1,200 people and taking over 250 hostages, the world was shaken. Hamas was the one pulling the trigger, but they didn't just grow up in a vacuum. Years of receiving cash, training, and tech from Iran had turned them into a highly sophisticated machine. Of course, whether Iran directly ordered the October 7th strike or not is still a complicated topic. The Wall Street Journal and several intel reports said that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps helped plan it and trained about 500 fighters right inside Iran beforehand. However, the US government at the time also carefully stated that they hadn't seen direct evidence showing Tehran pressed the final launch button. It's kind of like you selling a gun, teaching someone how to shoot, pointing out their enemy's house, but you just aren't at the scene when the murder actually happens. Right after that tragedy, Israel rained hellfire on Gaza. By 2024, the death toll in Palestine had crossed 40,000, a humanitarian disaster that the UN described as beyond imagination, with the vast majority of victims being women and children. And here's the mechanical effect of war. The very blood spilled in Gaza became the catalyst, pumping a massive dose of political adrenaline into pro-Iran forces across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, getting them to simultaneously open up new fronts. But the moment the key actually snapped in the lock was on April 1st, 2024. Israel launched an airstrike, leveling the Iranian consulate building in Damascus, Syria, wiping out 2 generals and several high-ranking officers. Hitting a consulate is like sneaking into your enemy's house and punching them right in the middle of their own living room. 12 days later, Iran hit back. For the first time in history, Tehran pressed the button to launch over 300 drones and missiles from their own soil straight into Israeli airspace. Even though 99% of them were intercepted thanks to the air defense grid of Israel, the US, and their allies, the strategic meaning was crystal clear. The shadow war had officially stepped out of the shadows. In September 2024, Israel proved to the world that modern warfare isn't just about bombs and bullets. It's about the ability to hack straight into your opponent's nervous system. Thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies belonging to Hezbollah members in Lebanon suddenly detonated all at once. Just imagine the device you clip to your belt every day to call for lunch suddenly turning into a hand grenade. Around 42 people died, nearly 4,000 were injured, and an estimated 1,500 fighters were knocked out of the fight. A strike that handed the enemy a perfect logistical nightmare. Just days later, on September 27th, Israel dropped over 80 bunker buster bombs, ripping through a bunker nearly 20 meters underground in Beirut, taking out Hassan Nasrallah, the supreme leader of Hezbollah, along with a top Iranian general. Tehran couldn't just sit still and watch their most prized asset get wiped off the map. In October 2024, they launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. Tel Aviv immediately hit back, crushing Tehran's air defenses and missile production capabilities. By the end of 2024, both sides had crossed red lines they swore they would never touch for decades. And then a massive domino fell. In late 2024, the Assad regime in Syria collapsed. Remember that land bridge I mentioned earlier? Iran's crucial Amazon Prime delivery route was snapped in half. Tehran didn't just lose an ally, they lost their entire strategic logistics corridor. As 2024 came to a close, Israel had battered Gaza, decapitated Hezbollah, and watched Syria slip completely out of Iran's orbit. There wasn't a single safety valve left working. 6. Kicking off an all-out war and the truth about deterrence. An all-out war rarely breaks out just because 2 sides suddenly hate each other more. It breaks out when the generals look at the clock and decide that waiting is way more dangerous than pulling the trigger. On February 28, 2026, the shadow story of a century officially got a bloody name. The US and Israel launched a massive coordinated campaign. The US side called it Operation Epic Fury, while Israel called it Operation Roaring Lion. This moment marked a covert conflict officially turning into a totally public, front-page war. This wasn't just a quick hit-and-run punch. It was a total takedown campaign. Missiles, military bases, and command centers all across Iran went up in flames. By mid-March, tons of major newspapers confirmed Israel had carried out over 15,000 airstrike sorties. The peak of this earthquake was when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed right in the opening wave of airstrikes, forcing Iran to scramble and rush Mossadegh Khamenei in to replace him. Leaked reports later revealed a chilling truth about the intel. The US and Israel had been tracking the target for months and got the precise geolocation info just hours before dropping the bombs. In this day and age, hiding a missile is easy, but hiding a human being from a network of satellites and spies is practically impossible. When the missiles rained down on Tehran, a harsh truth was laid bare. Their shield had gotten a whole lot thinner. US officials later confirmed that the bulk of Iran's high-end air defenses could no longer stand in the way of the coalition's fighter jets. Clearly, buying an air defense insurance package with a Russian label didn't give the peace of mind they advertised. However, the precision of high-tech weapons never equals the innocence of war. Over in the city of Minab, Iran reported that a girls' school was hit by an airstrike, killing around 165 students and teachers. Even though open-source investigations showed this was highly likely the fallout of a decision based on outdated US intel, it still reminds us of one universal truth. No matter how smart bombs get, they don't have a built-in morality filter. Backed into a corner, Iran swung its final punch by hitting straight at the global economy. They unleashed a barrage of missiles at Israel, US bases, and crucially, they ordered the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. This is a tight bottleneck where 20% of the entire world's oil has to pass through every single day. If you're an American watching this video, this is the exact moment a story in some faraway desert crashes straight into your power bill and the price board at your local gas station. But the biggest shock for Tehran actually came from their neighbors. When the open war broke out, the Arab world didn't line up to protect Iran at all. Instead of uniting in an axis of resistance like the slogan says, multiple Gulf nations condemned Iran for firing missiles that crossed into their airspace. Iran's proxy network looked visibly weakened. Hamas in Gaza was just in pieces. Hezbollah was bleeding heavily but still trying to fire back. And the rebels in Iraq or Yemen didn't have the muscle to flip the board. The promise of a perfect ring of fire was totally punctured. Right inside Iran, society cracked in half on a split screen. One half of the screen showed tens of thousands of people joining state-sponsored Quds Day rallies to flex their power. The other half showed smuggled cell phone videos capturing cheers and music blasting in a few neighborhoods when they heard the supreme leader had died. Iranian society right now is a deep, gaping fracture between the ruling machine and the people, and this war just shined a massive spotlight straight onto that crack. 7. An uncertain future and the receipt of history. At this point, the biggest question isn't who fired the first bullet anymore. The game has shifted to who can tolerate this pain the longest. This war is restructuring the superpower chessboard and picking your pocket in a way you can't escape. The Strait of Hormuz is getting strangled. Market reports have already logged Brent crude oil tearing past the $100 a barrel mark. Natural gas prices in Europe have had days where they spiked by almost 50% as pumping stations in Saudi Arabia and Qatar got caught in the crosshairs. Keep this mechanism in mind. Once the flow through Hormuz gets choked off, this is no longer just foreign policy news. It becomes breaking news about your grocery bill. On the grand chessboard, the real boss cashing in is sitting over in Moscow. Russia is scooping up massive profits from skyrocketing oil prices, all while kicking back and watching the US scramble to pull Patriot batteries and interceptor missiles out of Ukraine to ship them to the Middle East. On the flip side, China is sweating bullets. Beijing buys over 80% of Iran's seaborne oil exports. They absolutely do not want to see the regime in Tehran fall, but they're even more terrified of Hormuz getting locked down because that would completely suffocate their own industry. So how long do you think the world will tolerate the Strait of Hormuz being frozen over before a true global coalition is forced to crush this blockade? Let me know your take down in the comments. To wrap things up, we've got 3 brutal takeaways from this entire story. Number 1, hastily drawn borders on a map and lying political promises from superpowers can rack up a blood receipt that lasts an entire century. Number 2, proxy warfare might give you a false sense of security, but the longer you play it, the closer it drags you to the edge of self-destruction. And number 3, in a tightly connected flat world, every missile that blows up in the Middle East leaves shrapnel in your wallet, by way of inflation, energy prices, and disrupted supply chains. So, if you ask why Iran and Israel are drowning in war right now, here's the real answer. It's because a century of torn-up maps, betrayed promises, revolutions, proxy armies, assassinations, and nuclear paranoia finally just ran out of room to maneuver. The war we're seeing today is just the latest chapter. The story started a long, long time before the very first missile ever left the launch pad. Thanks for watching the Capital Anatomy. If this video helped you see through this complicated chessboard, go ahead and hit like, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so we can see each other again in our next deep dive analysis. See you next time.